For this first offering of Urantia University Institute's introductory course, I realized after recording the frames of reference video that it would probably be best to skip the Urantia book as an artifact discussion for now and go right to considering the implications of this revelation's being a book. So, please forgive this minor interruption in the sequence and welcome to this perspective of study discussion about the Urantia book as a book. We're going to look at some qualities, attributes, challenges, and preconceptions associated with the Urantia book that exist simply because of the fact that the fifth epical revelation is a book. We'll especially focus on context and art. Let's start with a simple question. Can a book be understood without a context? Can we study a book strictly on its own terms without reference to anything else? Does it stand on its own, unrelated to the time and place of its origin, to the cultural and historical setting within which it was written? I suspect that when talking about a revelation, we'd tend to say, no, it doesn't matter. This is a timeless presentation, that the revelers spoke only from their own context, that the human time and place of its writing are irrelevant to what it says, either in the present or in the future. But here's a quick thought experiment. If we were to discover a book, a Urantia book perhaps, and could tell nothing at all about where or when it came from, could we understand it? Sure, why not, is the response that probably comes to mind, but I'd have to say, no, we couldn't. Does that mean I think the Urantia book means nothing if read on its own? No, but I am taking context seriously. First of all, if you had no context at all for a book that came into your hands, you couldn't even read it, because you wouldn't know the language, and language is the first context for anything written. The language immediately places limits around the time and place of a book's writing. To illustrate, let's imagine that the Urantia book we discovered was an author's manuscript, written in the language of our local universe, as it may well have originally been. It would still be the Urantia book, but could you read it, study it, understand it, put it to use in your own life? We won't go into a theory of language here, but I think you'll agree that if you didn't know the language a book was written in, and had no magic key, no Rosetta Stone to assist you, you couldn't read it. But lucky for us, we can read English, and the Urantia book is written in English, not in Nebuchadnezzar. But is my English the same as the author's? If I know all the words, does that mean I'll have no trouble decoding the author's intentions? Given how closely we study the words of the revelators, this is an important question. There are several factors that may prevent me from understanding an author writing in English, and of those, one of the most important is that languages aren't static. The words and constructions change over time, which can sometimes make reading even your native language problematic. The Urantia book's English is less than 100 years old, but many people have noted that even after such a short time, some of the language in the Urantia book seems overly formal or quaint, and we sometimes even have to use a dictionary to figure out what it says. If we were to go back 400 years instead of 100 years, we'd be reading early modern English of the 16th and 17th centuries, and we know it takes a dictionary and a lot of footnotes to help us understand much of what authors such as Shakespeare wrote in those times. If we go back another 200 years to Chaucer's day, the end of the 14th century, we're trying to read Middle English, and it's very difficult to figure out what's going on. A dictionary isn't much use at all, and we're dependent on notes by a scholar to figure it out. And if we should go even further back, we're dealing with Old English, and our ability to understand it drops to almost nothing. It's a completely foreign language, having little more in common with modern English than does modern German. You may be wondering why I'm taking this trip down through the history of English. It's because the English used by the authors sometimes reaches far back into history, even all the way to Shakespeare's period. And though the language is familiar, it may not mean what we think it does. This is particularly true in the case of biblical quotations. The author's use of this language creates three challenges. One, simply understanding what's being said, and of much more interest, understanding why the authors would use a language that is both archaic and confusing. And then, even more interesting, applying these insights about their use of language to the rest of the book, even where ancient forms are not being used. The way they use the Bible helps us to see something of what they were trying to do as they wrote the book, of the kinds of tools they brought to bear on their mission, and the way they went about accomplishing it. This is important for us to do because very many Urantians, if not most, if not the great majority, look at the text of the Urantia book and see only one kind of presentation, precisely used language which means exactly the same thing everywhere in the book. Sure, we notice a few places where they use humor and a few places where they seem to be writing beautifully, even poetically, about the truths they are trying to convey. But even in these cases, we have a strong tendency to believe they're using the language very precisely, that they mean exactly what the words themselves convey to anyone with a reasonable grasp of English who studied the book closely. I've seen many tortured attempts to force the author's language to fit into some preconceived notion of precision, to either solve a perceived problem or even to create another puzzling problem. It's my considered opinion, which I want you to test for yourself, that the authors used English in many different ways and for many different purposes, just like any author does. There are times when they use the language precisely, and there are terms which they attempt to define precisely and to use consistently. But they also employ art to convey what they either can't say or choose not to say directly. They use cultural touchstones to place the book, hence the reader, within a certain emotional, intellectual, or spiritual frame to enhance their message. And they use what I'll call natural language. They use English in the same natural and careful but non-technical way any good human author does. In short, they employ the art of composition to enhance the message they intend to convey. We're often tempted to think of the entire Urantia book as a technical manual, a textbook. I'd like to suggest that it's more often a work of art. And when compared with technical writing, art may be less precise, but more accurate, less factual, but more truthful. I want you to try to become more aware of the language used by the revelators. And I want you to ask yourself, often, why did the authors write the way they did? How did they use the language? Why did they use it that way? Why did they use the biblical text they did, and in the forms they did? Were they just trying to convey information, just showing us how the biblical authors got it right once in a while? Were they giving us a revelator-approved precise translation of the original languages? Or maybe they were simply giving us the clear and accurate meaning of what the original author intended, no matter how that thought might have been written in the original language, or how it's been subsequently translated from Hebrew or Greek or whatever into modern English. And I'm sure you've heard various people make every one of those claims about the biblical quotations in the Urantia book. Let's look at an example and see if any of those common explanations hold up, and where that leads us. Verse 23 of Job 37 is found in the Urantia book twice in slightly different forms. The references are in your reading list for the week. In paper 2 it reads, touching the infinite, we cannot find him out. And in paper 96 it's touching the Almighty, we cannot find him out. Almighty is actually the word found in most Bible translations, but they're both referring to the same verse. The English is a little old-fashioned, but it seems to be fairly clear. What do you think it means? How would you paraphrase it? It wouldn't hurt to pause the video right here and write down your paraphrase. I suspect you wrote down, or would have written down if you'd stopped watching the video, that touching the Almighty, we cannot find him out, means something like reaching for the Almighty, we cannot find him, or contacting the Almighty, or perhaps something like, though we can touch the Almighty, we cannot find him. Let's put those answers aside for the moment while we trace that passage through the history of English Bibles and see if we can learn anything helpful about its actual meaning. Luckily, we can get modern copies of even ancient books, so here are the versions we'll be looking at. In order of age from left to right, the earliest dates from about 1390, the latest from 1990. I've selected these from among the scores of English translations because these are all representatives of the King James tradition. They either contributed to it or are revisions of it. except the Wycliffe Bible, which I've included more for confusion than anything else. The very first English translation of the Bible dates from the late 14th century. I'm going to show you all of these here so that you can examine them and so you won't be disadvantaged by my atrocious pronunciation of medieval English. This is the passage from what's come to be known as the Wycliffe Bible, the first complete Bible in English published in stages between 1382 and 1395, during which time Chaucer's Canterbury Tales were also written. It's named for John Wycliffe, who translated the Gospels, but one of his associates would have been responsible for this passage from Job. These translators worked from the Latin Vulgate rather than from the original languages. If you find this rendition challenging, you're not alone. The second rendering is from the Geneva Bible, which, as with all the following versions, was translated directly from Hebrew. This was the Bible of the Puritans and of Shakespeare, and much of its beautiful language carried over into the King James and is reflected in Bibles right down to the present. Here's the King James, or Authorized Version. The King James hardly needs much introduction, so let's just note that it was first published in 1611, and that it is by far the most influential work in English that's ever been written. Its role in forming the language as well as culture and religion in the English-speaking world is unequaled. But by the late 19th century, a number of better texts of the Bible had come to light, and English had evolved, so it was thought wise to revise the King James. This work was eventually published in two versions. The Old Testament of the English Revised Version was released in 1885, and that version, further revised by American scholars, was published in 1901. The latter has come to be called the American Standard Version. These were the most current King James tradition translations available at the time of the writing of the Urantia book. And as you can see, these are both the same, and are in turn identical with the King James. Now here's the Urantia book's rendering. To the best of our knowledge, it was written in 1934, but it wasn't published until 1955. As you can see, it's the same as the previous three versions, except for the minor point that touching isn't italicized the way it is in the Bibles. Actually, maybe that isn't a minor point, but more on that in a moment. To bring you up to the present, here are three subsequent revisions in the King James tradition. This one is the Revised Standard Version. This translation was done after the Urantia book was written, but it was published a few years earlier, in 1952. It was a revision of the American Standard Version. Then came the New American Standard Bible, a slightly later revision of the American Standard Version, and then the New Revised Standard Version, a very recent revision of the Revised Standard Version. Except for Wycliffe, they're all quite similar. The main difference between them is the appearance of touching in the King James, which is carried through in the Revised Version, the American Standard Version, and the Urantia book, but then disappears. Before we talk about touching specifically, I'd like to read you a bit of a paragraph from the preface to the Harper Study Bible edition of the Revised Standard Version that talks about the reasons for undertaking these more modern translations. And make sure you note the examples you'll find a few of them familiar from the Urantia book. I've put a copy of this paragraph up on the reading list for the week, so if you don't have a perfect memory, don't worry. Here's what the Harper's Edition editors have to say. A major reason for revision of the King James Version, which is valid for both the Old Testament and the New Testament, is the change since 1611 in English usage. Many forms of expression have become archaic, while still generally intelligible. The use of, say, thee, thy, thine, it came to pass that, whosoever, whatsoever, insomuch that, because that, aforetime, must needs, would fain, behooved, etc. Other words are obsolete and no longer understood by the common reader. But the greatest problem, however, is presented in those English words which are still in constant use, but now convey a different meaning from that which they had in 1611 and in the King James Version. These words were once accurate translations of the Hebrew and Greek scriptures, but now, having changed in meaning, they have become misleading. They no longer say what the King James translators meant them to say. Thus, the King James Version uses the word let in the sense of hinder, prevent to mean proceed, allow in the sense of approve, communicate for share, conversation for conduct, etc. They might have added touching to that list of words in common use now that meant something entirely different in the King James Bible. Touching in the King James Version is used exclusively with the meaning regarding or concerning. It is never used in the sense of reaching out and touching. Well, that ruins the paraphrases we did earlier, doesn't it? Let's look again at the translations. We noted earlier that the word touching is italicized in the King James and in the other translations in which we find it. And notice, too, that it is italicized in the Geneva version of the verse. Do you know what that means? Well, as it turns out, starting with the Geneva Bible and carried on in the King James and these others, italics were used as a convention to indicate words that have been interpolated into the text to make an obscure phrase in the original clearer in English. In other words, it is in the Geneva and touching in the King James, Revised, American Standard versions have been added by the editors to fill in the blanks that exist in English if you translate the Hebrew word for word. The rendering we see in the three most recent versions, the Almighty, we cannot find him, is actually about as close as you can get in English to the original Hebrew. The Geneva translators thought placing it is at the beginning of the verse was the best way of conveying the thought, and the King James translators thought that it would be helpful to insert touching there. Thus, the verse in the King James, in more modern terms, would be something like, concerning the Almighty, we cannot find him, or regarding the Almighty, we cannot find him. It emphatically did not mean something like, reaching out to the Almighty, we cannot find him. The King James translators didn't mean that, and the author of Job didn't mean that. That particular use of touching has been obsolete for some time. Why would the authors of the Urantia book use a biblical quote in a form that was bound to be misleading to almost everyone who would read the book, from the 1930s to the present and on into the future? I'm not suggesting the authors misunderstood the King James, but we do, so why would they write it this way? If they didn't want to use their own rendering, which they sometimes do elsewhere, it would have been far less confusing to modern readers if the authors had used the Geneva translation. So what were the authors doing? And why? And how? This isn't about theology, it's about language and the art of writing. I believe that in the Urantia book's use of biblical references, they were attempting to provide an emotionally comfortable place for the reader to be, by using reassuringly familiar language, even if it was archaic and not particularly accurate. The familiarity of the rendering was more important than the accuracy of the translation. For the sake of placing the Urantia book firmly within the familiar and non-threatening Christian tradition, they were willing to sacrifice accuracy of language, even of concept. I'd like to suggest that it's fruitful when reading the Urantia book to first look at the art. Let their intent strike you, and only then, when you have a sense of their purpose in writing and of the methods they're using to achieve their purpose, only then should you examine the words. Words are tools in the service of thought. If precision is their purpose, precise writing might be their tool of choice. But precision is not always their purpose. Indeed, because of the inadequacies of English, it usually cannot be their purpose. As many have said before, the authors are attempting to communicate truth, not necessarily facts. So, should we treat the words they use as fixed facts, or recognize that those words may be employed to artfully gesture toward the truths the authors are attempting to convey? To reiterate my central thesis before we finish up, the authors of the Urantia book used English in many different ways and for many different purposes, just like any human author does. There are times when they use language precisely, and times they employ art to convey what they can't say directly. They use cultural touchstones to place the book and the reader within a certain emotional, intellectual, or spiritual frame to accomplish their purposes. And they use what I call natural language They use English in the same natural and careful but non-technical way that any good human author does. In short, they employ the art of composition to enhance the message they intend to convey. We're often tempted to think of the entire Urantia book as a technical manual, a textbook. I found that it's more often a work of art. And when compared with technical writing, art may be less precise, but more accurate, less factual, but more truthful. Our next trip down context lane will be about placing the Urantia book in conceptual history. Or maybe it'll be an exercise in form criticism. Prepare yourself. And while you're preparing yourself, do this week's readings and exercises. Thank you. See you next time.